Bienvenidos, bienvenue, and welcome to this webinar titled The 1619 Curriculum, 1776 Commission, and 1776 Project, More Than a Difference of 150 Years. Thank you for registering, and more importantly, thank you for remembering to attend yet another Zoom event. I'm excited about the evening, and I hope that you are too. I am Danae Elizabeth Davis. Davis is my slave name, Elizabeth, my mother's first name, and Danae, the name given to me by my dad. I'm associate professor in the Teaching and Learning Department at Montclair State University in the great state of New Jersey. My personal pronouns are she and her. I will be your host and panel moderator with a little help from my friends. We must acknowledge that Montclair State University sits on 255 acres of ancient homeland and unceded traditional territory of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape people. The Nanticoke are the original people of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, and Delaware, where they once numbered in the tens of thousands. Their land, filched by Europeans in the 1700s, sent many of the Nanticoke to Ontario, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin, and also hiding into plain sight. Today, the Nanticoke number in the low thousands in this Northeast region. Let us give deference to the past history and the continuing presence of the Lenni Lenape people on their homeland and throughout the diaspora. At this time, we'll have a little bit of housekeeping. Antonella?
Hi everyone, my name is Antonella Ramirez and I'll be going over the housekeeping rules. So firstly for tonight, we're going to be using hashtags. So we're going to be using hashtag 1619 and hashtag 1619 MSU. So if you don't know too much about hashtags, you should think of hashtags as a way to connect to connecting social media content to a specific topic, event, theme, or conversation. They also make it easier to discover posts on Twitter or Instagram or other social media sites around those specific topics. And for example, so after tonight's meeting, if you use the hashtag, if you post something, let's say on Twitter, and you use the hashtag 1619, whoever searches that hashtag will be able to see what you posted or see what other posts are there about that topic. So if you use the hashtag 1619, this will allow this community to connect with conversations and activities elsewhere on the internet. And if you use the hashtag 1619 MSU, this will allow us within this community to stay connected. And secondly, throughout the evening, there are going to be several slides with QR codes. So in order to access the QR codes, you will have to use the camera application on your smartphone or smart devices. So you would open the camera application and then point it to the QR code as if you're taking a picture of it, and it will direct you to a website with more information about the content on that slide. And thirdly, this evening is going to be recorded. So if anyone wants to revisit the webinar, you can certainly do so. Right now we're live streaming this webinar on the College of Education and Human Services Facebook page, and it will also be uploaded there after it's recorded. And lastly, just about the QA feature. So if you have any questions throughout the night, please feel free to ask questions in the QA chat box, and we'll be happy to answer the questions. And if you have any specific questions towards any of the specific panelists, please make sure to use the @ or include their name in the question, and we'll make sure to send the question to the panelists. And if you have any general questions for the general panelists, you could also just write a question as well, and we'll make sure to answer it throughout the evening.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll try my hand at using a hashtag tonight. I also want to take a moment to thank the College of Education and Human Services and the Department of Teaching and Learning for co-sponsoring tonight's event. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Yoon Tran, Associate Dean of the College, and Dr. Sumi Higawara, who is the chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning, to extend greetings on behalf of their respective units if they are in the room. Joe, do you see either Dr. Tran or Dr. Higawara? There's Dr. Tran. Hello. We can't hear you though. Nope.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear Dr. Higawara, so maybe we'll start with you.
Hi, yes, welcome to everyone, our distinguished panelists and guests. Thank you to Dr. Davis for moderating this important discussion on 1617 versus 1776. I'm Sumi Hagiwara, I chair the Department of Teaching and Learning. And I just wanted to thank you for bringing this discussion to the public. We all know that storytelling matters, and it's a lens through which we come to define ourselves and see the world around us. It informs our belief systems and our actions. And I think speaking for myself, there are both no words and many words that can be used to describe the efforts to sanction one version of history. So thank you to Leslie Wilson, Kimya Jackson, Jessica Ferreras-Stone, Zoe Burkholder, Kevin Arroyo, and Danae Davis again for creating this platform.
Thank you. Thanks for your words and co-sponsorship. Dr. Tran, do we have audio?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hargua and Dr. Davis. I'm Yoon Tran. As Dr. Davis has just mentioned, I'm Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the College of Education and Human Services. I want to welcome our members of the panel and express my appreciation for your time. And thank you, Dr. Davis, again for organizing tonight's event. Some of you may know that our college has been working in the last several years to advance the principles of social justice and equity by engaging with various stakeholders across our campus and in our college with a variety of activities, such as hosting a panel related to students of color so that we can hear from them on how best to support their needs and success at MSU. We've also engaged in college-wide meetings to challenge our own biases. And this year, we've been leading several different faculty forums to adopt strategies related to anti-racist teaching. However, we're not alone in this endeavor, and we're grateful for all of our MSU colleagues, especially the ones in CHSS and throughout the university, as well as all the educators that are going to be here tonight on the panel across the US who are also committed to this anti-racist action during this critical juncture of our lives. Most of you will hear tonight and would also agree that the US history is very convoluted and complex. Now that we're 8 months into the pandemic, which has shed light on systemic racism and access to quality healthcare for Black and Brown Americans, which further has exacerbated structural and institutional problems, it's very timely and appropriate that we start to dig deep to examine the roots and persistence of today's racial inequalities. We actually need to start acknowledging that racism is embedded deep into this nation's DNA. History has been taught incorrectly in schools through Anglo-centric values and ideologies. We're long overdue for correcting those histories of marginalized Black Americans and understanding the crucial role that they have played in shaping the fabric of this nation. Again, I want to thank you for your participation tonight. I see that we have over 100 participants, and I expect that you're going to have a rich conversation and hear plenty of exchanges from the intellectual wisdom of Dr. Davis, tonight's moderator, as well as our expert panelists who Dr. Hagawara has just shared. Thank you again for Dr. Leslie Wilson, Dr. Jessica Ferreras-Stone, Dr. Zoe Burkholder, and Ms. Kimya Jackson and Mr. Kevin Arroyo. As you engage in discourse of 1619 versus 1776, two very important dates in our history. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Davis.
Thank you very much for that wonderful opening and helping to lay the foundation. Because this evening we do gather to discuss the question, where does U.S. history begin for you? Certainly curriculum debates regarding the instruction of the founding of the United States and the formation of its democracy are not new, as we've heard. However, at this moment, on the eve of the rising COVID-19 infections, racial and unrest, Hurricane Zeta, and the presidential election some dub the most important election of our lives, the Trump administration has seemed to stoke the fire regarding the teaching of, quote, American history in US public schools. Consider this timeline, and I have a few dates I'd like to share with you. On September the 1st, the president announced an investigation of California public schools' possible use of the 1619 project curriculum. Affiliated with the Pulitzer Center, the goal of this curriculum is to, quote, reframe American history by considering what it would mean if we regarded 1619 as this nation's birth year, end quote. From that perspective, school children would learn about the English privateer ship called the White Lion and its, quote, 20 and odd Negroes, end quote, arriving at Point Comfort, Virginia. Now that was 1 year before the Saints and the Strangers of the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. The Trump administration has threatened to defund any California school found using this complementary educational resource. It is important to note the federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over school curricula. Local districts do. And it is also important to note that the United States does not have a national curriculum. However, states and boards of education are incentivized for adopting federal policies and guidelines. Here's another date, September the 4th, 2 months ahead of the presidential election. The Trump administration prohibited coverage of anti-racist and racial sensitivity training in federal agencies. White privilege, white supremacy, and critical race theory are especially and expressly banned. Through a written directive, the administration forbids teaching any content by federal agencies that suggests the US is, quote, an inherently racist or evil country, end quote, or that, quote, any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil, end quote. The ban was later solidified in an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, deeming such messaging anti-American. Deeming such messaging anti-American, the administration has warned failure to adhere to this edict would result in a loss of agency funding. Federal contracts are prohibited from teaching this content. It is uncertain whether colleges and universities receiving government support will lose dollars, federal dollars. However, there is a growing chilling effect where faculty lectures and instruction are being censored. In response, this afternoon, the National Urban League and the National Fair Housing Association, with support from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, their legal defense fund, has filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court demanding an immediate repeal of the Trump administration's executive order. We'll have to stay tuned. Another date, September the 17th. It's called Constitution Day in the United States. The president announced the formation of the 1776 Commission. Through executive order, he will charge. Through executive order, he will charge. Through executive order, he will charge the 1776 Commission with designing an instructional resource to advance patriotic education. The work of the commission will encourage our educators to teach our children about the miracle of American history. To date, my research has not found any evidence nor heard announcement of the formation of a 1776 Commission. Then, days after that announcement, the administration, through its Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, lauded the rollout of the 1776 Unites curriculum. Associated with the Woodson Center, this curriculum is said to offer a more complete and inspiring history of African Americans in the United States. Its curriculum page launched sometime last month, announcing an initial installment for high school students with K through 8 modules to follow. Currently, there are 3 modules, and one of those features Mr. Woodson. As aforementioned, tonight's guiding question is, where does U.S. history begin for you? While I am a fan of history, I must defer to the experts. Our panel consists of scholars, researchers, teachers, administrators, mentors, and some really nice friends and people. We have Dr. Wilson. He is Associate Dean for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Montclair State University. A professor of history, Dr. Wilson is an expert on environmental racism in New York City, community development, American history, and African American studies. He is also an active person and colleague in contributing to the promotion of New Jersey's Amistad legislation. That legislation is the law passed in 2002 requiring the incorporation of African American history into the New Jersey Social Studies curriculum. We also have with us tonight Kimya Jackson. She is an elementary educator and recently appointed assistant principal at Redwood and Washington Elementary Schools in West Orange, New Jersey. Ms. Jackson is a doctoral student in Montclair State University's Teacher Education Development program. She has been an adjunct instructor of social studies in the arts at Montclair State. Ms. Jackson is also a veteran second grade teacher at Redwood Elementary School. All of those things combined then earned her a 2019 Teacher of the Year, Educator of the Year by the West Orange Chamber of Commerce community. We also have with us Mr. Kevin Arroyo. He is here representing our high school strand. He is presently the chair of the History and Social Studies Department at Newark's American History High School. As such, Mr. Arroyo is a member of the leadership team of the Newark's 5th Magnet High School. Established in 2007, the school was founded as a collaboration between the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, Rutgers University, and the New Jersey Historical Society. Today, the school focuses on creating programming around its theme, the Institute of Social Justice and Democracy. On the other side of the country, we have with us Jessica Ferreras-Stone. Zoom is a way to bring us together. She is assistant professor of elementary education at Washington University in Western Washington University. Dr. Ferreras-Stone's scholarship centers on multicultural education. Unique to her approach is the use of free podcasts as pedagogical tools in teacher education. Dr. Ferreras-Stone is featured on the website of Western Washington University's 2018 and 2019 Innovative Teaching Showcase, and related videos of her doing that work are on the internet. We also have with us tonight Zoe Burkholder. She is professor of educational foundations at Montclair State. Her research focuses on the history of racial equality and school integration in the United States. Dr. Burkholder is the author of 3 books. The first, An African American Dilemma, A History of School Integration and Civil Rights in the North. That is under contract with Oxford University Press, due for 2021 release. The second book, Integrations, The Struggle for Racial Equality and Civic Renewal in Public Education. That too has a 2021 release by the University of Chicago Press. Her third book, which is available now, is titled Color in the Classroom, How American Schools Taught Race from 1900 through 1954. Dr. Burkholder is the director of MSU's Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Project. Along with our panel, we have Joseph Bavazzano, who is here. He is the director of MSU's ADP Center for Learning Technologies, housed in the College of Education and Human Services. The ADP offers tons of tech workshops, trainings, and supports, not only to the campus, but also to friends of Montclair State. Tonight, Joe is managing the technology and serving as our web producer. I also want to recognize Antonella Ramirez. Ms. Ramirez, is a graduate student enrolled in Montclair State University's Master of Art in School Counseling program. She is responsible for the flyer that is promoting tonight's event. Antonella is also working with me as a graduate assistant, and as she shared at the top of the hour, will assist with the Q&A. So, are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready to listen to this panel of 5 educators discuss some facts, not fake news, about U.S. history? Are you ready to learn how some educators decide which content to incorporate into their classrooms in remote teaching? And are you ready to take some of that information presented and allow it to relaunch the ways in which you understand U.S. history and teaching? So here we go. Ready? And Tanela, why don't you help us with the first question?
Yes. So our first question for tonight is directed toward Dr. Wilson. So the dates 1619 and 1776 are integral to our conversation. So Dr. Wilson, can you please paint a picture for us of what life was like in colonial America? Like who was there, who was arriving, and how, especially with these dates in mind?
Hi, everyone. So, 1619 is an important year for the British colonies. It's not an important year for the Spanish colonies. And so I need to preface my remarks by saying that the Spanish had come to North America first, and that the Spanish had already settled in various places in North America, including Florida. The British then tried to usurp the Spanish colonies by coming in and taking over land that the Spanish had claimed on the virtues of Columbus's discoveries in 1492 to 1501. What's important about that is that technically the British were using the victory at the Spanish Armada for their reason of claiming the land on the eastern coast of the United States. They will also, in the subsequent years, try to claim the land on the western coast, which became California and Oregon. So in 1619, the British had already had 2 colonies in what is now the state of Virginia, or what is near the state of Virginia. The first colony, Roanoke, was formed in the 1580s, and that colony failed. And they formed a second colony in Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. In the year 1619, a ship with a checkered past sailed into the harbor, and that ship was known as the White Lion. The White Lion came in, and the legend, because it's a legend, it's not necessarily true, but the legend is that the people on the ship, which was a British ship, had acquired 20 and odd Angolans from the Portuguese. In essence, they were really pirates. They had attacked the Portuguese ship, which had captured Angolans from Africa, and now they were coming to this British colony, and they were willing to trade these Africans for food and water. And so August 1619 begins the history of African Americans or Africans in British North America. Out of this group, out of these 20 odd people, we only know the story of a handful of them, but the most famous of this group is Anthony. And what we are told about his experience is that all 20 were indentured servants, and they only served servitude for about 7 years. Anthony gained his freedom. He took a bride from one of the 20. They married. They were free. He acquired land. They had a child, and their child is recognized as the first African American. The story goes a little bit further, but we usually don't share that story because over time, Anthony does exactly what everyone else is doing. Anthony becomes a large landowner, and he also acquires people who are held in bondage. Antonella, I have answered your question, I hope.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That was great. I certainly didn't learn anything about Anthony when I was growing up, and the fact that he then became a landowner and the implications from that were not part of my history and my history lessons. Thank you. Next, let's turn to Dr. Burkholder. Dr. Burkholder, this question is for you. Now that we have some societal historical context, give us a sense of what education was like and what schools were like in 1619 and 1776. Of course, Zoom and Google Classrooms and the internet were non-existent, but what did exist and what did the notion of education as we know it today begin? Yeah, and where were some of the debates associated with how schools and what's taught in them?
All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here. This is really exciting. So to answer your question, what were schools like in the United States or in the Virginia colonies in 1619 and in 1776? The short answer is that we didn't have them yet. What we think of today as public schools, which are free for the children who attend them, they're supported by local taxes, and they're open to everybody. Those schools didn't become available until starting in the early 19th century, maybe between the 1820s and the 1860s in the Northeast. And those schools spread to the South and the Midwest and beyond after that time, really after the end of the Civil War. So if you go back to 1619, for example, what you would find is, like Professor Davis said, Plymouth hadn't even been founded by the Pilgrims yet. And in Virginia, these colonists from England barely had a hold on the land there at all. They had a very difficult time surviving, and that was where their energies were directed. And in fact, many, at times most, of the early settlers there were dying. So education was what we might think of as very informal. The children who were there would have been educated by their parents, essentially, and that would change and evolve and grow over time. And it's interesting to move forward and look into this period of the American Revolution and 1776, because here is when Americans first proposed the idea of what we might think of as public education. And the idea came from a number of thinkers at the time, but Thomas Jefferson proposed a bill to try to get people in Virginia to fund education for all children. He was proposing 3 years of education that would be supported by taxes, available to both boys and girls, although of course, only free ones, not African Americans or enslaved ones, and not Native Americans at the time. So it was a limited proposal, and interestingly, it was shot down. That is, Americans at the time were not ready or willing to countenance the idea of paying to educate other people's children. That was essentially too radical of an idea for its time, and it wouldn't come until the 19th century, in part when Americans, especially white middle-class elite Americans, began to worry and fret that growing numbers of immigrants from Europe were changing the character of the American nation. And so public education, which expanded in the 1840s through the 1860s, was seen as a way to help assimilate and kind of create a common culture of a large group of immigrants. But very quickly, what happens is American history is taught, in these early common schools in the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, Americans are disagreeing over what should be taught, especially in terms of US history and how it should be taught. And so there's some really interesting scholarship that examines these debates that first appeared right around 1910, 1911. They exploded during the First World War, and they continued on for decades, kind of flaring up, often alongside major political events that prompted people to take a new or a renewed interest in what schools were teaching about American history. And I forgot I had that slide. Do I still have that slide up? I do, right? So people have this new interest in what schools are teaching about American history, and they're disagreeing over what is being taught. For some people, it was a question of being left out. So for many people, including Native Americans and African Americans, but many white ethnic immigrant groups like Polish Americans or German Americans or Norwegian Americans would go to their local school boards and complain that their children weren't learning enough about their ethnic groups or their racial groups' contribution to American history. In other cases, there were challenges to what the story was. In other words, who are we as a nation? Are we a nation of immigrants where everyone is treated fairly and assimilating towards this general ideal of freedom and equality? Or are we a country where terrible inequalities have plagued our nation from the very beginning, and it has been an ongoing struggle, not necessarily one that has been successful to remedy those inequalities? I think it's interesting to look at US history textbooks. I always like to pull up whatever my kids are using, and taking a look at the cover of history textbooks can be so fascinating, because you can often tell like what kind of angle a book is taking or what kind of image about our past a particular textbook is trying to project by looking at the cover. So sometimes the covers feature great white men. Other times they show a kind of motley collection of immigrants, like the one in the middle on the screen there, but also this sense of kind of joyful celebration and progress. I think in the background of that one is a train, a locomotive, right? Showing kind of progress and industry and our great American story. And the final textbook cover on the screen in front of you is actually a textbook that focused on African American history. So if you look at schools in the South in the 1930s, many of them, interestingly, had not just two textbooks, one for white students and one for Black students, because the Black students were in segregated schools. But schools in the South also used textbooks that were different than what other states were using in the rest of the country. So scholars called those mint julep textbooks, and they were American history textbooks that portrayed both the Civil War and slavery according to terms that white Southern elites dictated. And these were basically falsehoods. They were just absolutely false claims. And because of that, scholars and people outside of the South refused to use those textbooks. So for many years, Americans actually had just multiple textbooks depending on who the constituency was. Like that's how we solved this debate over what should be taught and how it should be taught in the public schools. So this debate today, 1776 versus 1619, in many ways, this isn't a new debate at all, but a very long-standing one that is just flared up in a very distinct context where we see not only the Trump presidency, which many liberals and progressives find excruciating in its degree of inequality, but also these new movements for racial and social justice that have motivated people to take a hard, critical look at what our schools are teaching and what kind of messages they are portraying. So I think I'll stop there for now.
That's great. It's interesting as you were giving that overview. I thought about the debate around textbooks in Texas, right? And so there's a difference with the mint julep textbooks in the South during this period, and then textbooks today. And then the piece about folks not wanting to pay to educate other people's children. And that reminds me of the debate around paying taxes, and folks will say, well, they don't have children in the schools. Why should they have to pay? So much of that tends to be very recursive in its happening. So
definitely, yeah.
I want to take a moment now to turn to Antonella. Are there any questions with regard to the history, the comments that Drs. Wilson and Burkholder have shared?
As of now, no. One of our participants gave us a link towards, it says Race and Belonging in Colonial America, story of Anthony Johnson.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'll share it with you guys.
Thank you. So let's shift now to the curricula that are part of our title, the 1619 Project Curriculum, the 1776 Commission, and the 1776 Unites. What are these initiatives? How do they differ? And because they do target K through 12 classrooms and with one specifically in high school, I'd like to turn to Mr. Arroyo, if you wouldn't mind, to start talking to us about your awareness of these curricula and or use of them. Did we leave Mr. Arroyo? Did we lose Mr. Arroyo? Excuse me.
Sorry about that, everybody.
That's
Good
okay.
evening. Good
Hi.
evening. 1619 project, Hannah Jones initiative through the New York Times, and the title, it's a 1619 project. So it's to be used in conjunction with a New Jersey state curriculum. And it's pretty much students were able to explore the various different topics, essays contained within the magazine. And they created different pieces. Some of them created performance pieces. Some of them engaged in lively conversations. Just really, they were really appreciative of getting this story from a different perspective. Through their K9, K-12 education, they've seen this 1776 curriculum before in their textbooks already. So just getting it from a different perspective just was really refreshing to see students engage in history. And I think at the end of the day, that's the purpose. We want to engage students in this type of critical thinking because that is the key essence of what historians do. And history is made to be challenged. The narratives that are carried out by the mainstream historians, it's okay if there's a different story out there. And I would definitely place that information right there where my students need it so that they could grapple with it and come to terms with what the solution will be moving forward.
Sounds good. Thank you. Ms. Jackson, I know that you are in schools, in an elementary school. Do any of these projects come up? Are teachers using them? Have you had a chance to consider its application or their application?
So I work at the elementary level, K through 5, not K through 8, where 1619 and 1776 projects and curriculum are useful. After exploring them, they are a little difficult for, I would say, K to 2. However, I do see it as a resource for teachers, right? So Dr. Burkholder and Dr. Wilson talked about history, and Dr. Davis, you expressed the fact that you weren't taught about Anthony when you were in school. So this is a great refresher, right, for the educator to then use this as a tool to craft lessons, but to directly use the 1619 project and or the 1776 curriculum with the 3 exposés that they have. When I explored them, they would need a lot of rewording to use them directly word for word. When I looked at 1619 from the Pulitzer Center, their essential questions, if you were asking K through 2 students directly, they would be difficult to answer, but if you reworded them slightly, they might be able to offer a starting point. Because one of the questions was about just knowing history and where do you start, right? So I can see teachers using this to give themselves more information, but to directly use it in a K through 5 setting, they would need a little recrafting for that.
Okay, thank you. Do other folks on the panel have perspective or commentary on these projects? Jessica, we haven't heard from you. I see Dr. Wilson, your hand is raised.
I can respond.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we're reminded of is the age appropriateness, right? And one of the challenges when working with young children is how do I still teach them accurate, mindful, critical thinking in an age appropriate way? And I think, like stated previously, this is something that this curriculum 1619 can guide us in. And I wanted to mention that there is, you heard there was going to be some podcasts coming from me. There's a podcast from Teaching Tolerance called Teaching Hard History. And it focuses on the importance of teaching slavery, both past and the longing effects of it to present day. And season 2 specifically addresses how to do this with elementary learners. And so one of my areas is elementary education. And so one of the barriers that I often face is, but they're so young and they're so cute. How can we break their innocence? And the truth is, I need to grow their mind, and they won't be ready to grow their mind when they get to college. If this is a hard process, we need to start at an early age with them. And I have found that podcast, particularly for those of you who are working with young learners, to be helpful of ways to frame this and ways to really foster this with young learners.
Thank you. We do have the slide up that has the QR code for Teaching Hard History, that podcast, if folks would like to open that with their smartphones and read the QR code. We'll come back to this as well. So Dr. Wilson, you had your hand raised and wanted to offer some commentary with regard to the your perspective and thought on these projects.
So I want to reinforce what everyone has said, and I want to go back to something that Mr. Royal said earlier, which is about the idea of narrative. Each of these different notions of history is really about narrative. It's not just about a starting point, but it's about an interpretation, and how do you put that interpretation into the minds of people's heads. And what Dr. Stone pointed out is that you have to do hard history at an early age. If you keep repeating the same history over and over again, by the time they get to high school, they get to college, they've heard the same story. And then when you get into graduate school, or you get to the end of high school into college, you struggle with it because it's something different. And it's like, someone has lied to me all along, and why have they lied to me? And so that narrative becomes really important. Is it an inclusive narrative, or is it an isolated narrative, or is it a fake feel-good narrative? And I think that's what these three projects are offering, right? That the 1776 Commission is a fake feel-good narrative. It's a narrative about America and American exceptionalism. We all believe that there is American exceptionalism, don't get me wrong. We don't believe the salad bowl and the pot and stirring everything together and everyone's happy. And that's the problem. We have been teaching kids for too long this idea that they are all in the same boat together and they all traveled the same stream. They were in different boats and they were not always in the same stream. And that becomes the important issue. And with the 1776 project, they are trying to counter the 1619 project. It's basically a fight between what you might say are Black moderates to radicals with Black conservatives to centrists. And so there's a fight there over where the starting point is and who to include in the story. The 1619 project has framed the story using a narrative of slavery. And it's telling a story of how slavery formed America and how slavery is integral to the development of American history. The 1776 project is basically saying, we don't want to deal with that story. We want to talk about the good ideas that African Americans brought into American history. And so there's a completely different story. So at the end of the day, if you use all three, you'll learn more about American history. If you just use one, you're just going to take away one narrative.
So that's an interesting perspective, right? Maybe that should be the push, right? To use all of these, and certainly anyone who teaches, as we all are educators, we certainly don't just use one approach or one methodology or one resource. It is important to provide a critical lens and also to provide a full lens of what has been written, what's been documented as history, to expand young people and their understandings. Antonella, I'm just checking in on questions. Any questions there?
No, nothing yet.
Okay, folks are welcome to ask questions if they'd like, or perhaps they just enjoy the pearls that we're sharing. I do want to shift to maybe a little more application. So, here we have this content. We have the case for slavery and the enslavement of Africans. We also have this notion of democracy and the founding of what is now the United States of America. We saw some text. Dr. Burkholder showed us some covers of text, but in addition to text, or maybe apart from text, what is it that you're using in your classrooms to help answer the question of slavery and sexism and capitalism? Are there particular essential questions that you work with? Are there particular resources that you use to answer those questions? Jessica, I know that you do a lot with podcasts. You want to elaborate a little bit more on the
Yeah,
use of
can you move to
podcasts?
my slide, Dr.
Sure.
Davis? So Dr. Wilson brought up the important idea of whose perspective are we honoring, and should we honor just one perspective, or should we bring in multiple perspectives? And this is a question that I use a lot when I'm teaching teachers how to be elementary social studies teachers. And so the series of questions that I really would encourage you to think about are the same ones that I use when I'm teaching this course. And it invites you to first consider, how has this content traditionally been taught? And I use that question because I don't want you to think this is the right way. This is the traditional way. The person who makes dessert for some meals at my house isn't the best one at making it, but traditionally they're the ones that have made it. And tradition can be broken for intentional reasons, right? So we have to acknowledge where tradition starts. Then we ask ourselves, okay, so that's the tradition. And in that tradition, who's telling the story? Who benefits when the narrative is told this way? And I invite you to think of this question so that you recognize this perspective, not the truth of the textbook or the curriculum or any one resource, but that you ask yourself, who's telling the story, and then who else might tell the story? So how can I get this rounded approach that Dr. Wilson invited us to think about, right? What are the multiple perspectives that need to be evaluated? And then once you know more than one narrative, right? When you ask yourself, who else might tell the story, that might necessitate you investigating further about this, because if you're like me, your social studies didn't teach you this well-rounded. And so I've had to relearn a lot of things, and I've had to search for this. And one of the ways that my students and I have found it to be beneficial, instead of reading scholarly journals, I don't have always as much time as I'd like for this. And so podcasts have been a really useful way to build my background knowledge. And so I would invite you to research various podcasts. Teaching Hard History is one that I think is really beneficial. And I also want to recommend the ACLU at Liberty podcast, because in order to teach history in a way that is meaningful, I would argue that you have to talk about the past while making connections to the present. Right. And so in order to make connections to the present, we can see these injustices in present day through the information that we get from the ACLU. And so that's how I would pair those two. And then once you know more about the content, then you can truly ask yourself, what are the multiple narratives and what are the narratives that I can include for a purposeful reason? And how am I going to make that meaningful? How do I know my audience to make that personally meaningful for them? So those are the series of questions that I would invite you to think about.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to our elementary educator, Ms. Jackson.
Yes.
How about, where do you start, and what strategies and approaches do you use?
So it's interesting that you asked me where I start for U.S. history. I start at the very beginning, because for those of us who know, in elementary school, we are teaching social studies as opposed to just history. So at the beginning of our textbooks, or many textbooks, we start with how to be a community member, who's in your community. Then we move to map skills. So basically, by the time we get to culture and or a sprinkle of history, it's at the end of the school year, at the end of the textbook. So the great thing that we have working in our favor at the elementary level are themes. Right, so we have monthly themes where we just finished Hispanic Heritage Month, and we're moving into Native American history. And I take that opportunity, or I used to take that opportunity, to start American history with Native Americans, such as the Lenape, because a lot of our students believe that they are non-existent and that they're extinct, such as dinosaurs. So I take the time to invite them into learning about the Lenape and moving them to the present, because like it was stated, we can't move forward if we don't know our past history, and they need to know that they're still here. So I don't start with enslaved people. I don't start with Europeans and immigrants. I do start with the people who were here first, or I used to start with the people who were here first. After the Lenape, I go on to talk about explorers, and I introduce the fact that explorers were not only those of European descent, but they are of other descent, like Africans, like we have here Gustavo, who also, I'm sorry, Estevanico, who traveled here way before other people did, right? So I don't start at enslavement because I want all of my students to know that they do have power and that they were not oppressed people. Not everyone was oppressed. So that's our beginning. The strategies that I used to use when I was in the classroom, which is not that far long ago, I use visual thinking strategies when we're talking about questions you ask. So, and I think Dr. Burkholder said something about, or maybe Jessica said something about teachers not feeling comfortable with this information or comfortable with these topics. So I would use visual thinking strategies where you show a picture like the one we have here by Leroy Campbell, where you see people or figures and it appears that they're picking cotton, right? So you show the picture and you ask what's going on. Well, you first start by saying, take a moment to look at this picture, right? And you use a pointer to go all around the picture so that you draw the students in. And after you do that, you ask, what's going on in this picture, right? Or what's going on in this piece of artwork? And you take the time to hear from students. And you would be surprised to hear what the students already know, right? And you use that as a starting point. So after that, then you say, what more can you find? And as you're listening to the students, then you open up a conversation about, okay, so you see cotton, you see brown people. What are some things you don't see, right? And why are they in this field, or why are they picking this cotton? And that can start a conversation, that uncomfortable conversation about enslaved peoples. The other thing I would use would be nonfiction and historical text. So if you see the cover here is Jelani and the Lock, which is a nonfiction text by Lorenzo Pace. It tells the story of his great-great-grandfather being kidnapped in Africa and brought to America, being enslaved. And when he was finally freed, the one thing he kept was that lock, right? And he kept that lock, and he sent it down through generations as a reminder of where he began here in America. So this is a nonfiction text that can be used with kindergarten students up to 5th grade or beyond to tell the story of enslaved people. I also use historical fiction text, such as You Choose books, where you have a story about maybe the civil rights movement or other stories, and the children have the opportunity to choose how they would travel through the story to hear about things that have happened in history. Another thing I would do for the last 16 years would be role playing with the Wax Museum. So if you see the picture off to what would be my right, you see children who are in my old classroom, and they are presenting as if they were great figures in history. And this particular museum was about African Americans in New Jersey, because a lot of people say, oh, well, we only have a few African Americans that we can study, the regulars, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X occasionally, Thurgood Marshall, but nice, comfortable people that you may find in the 1776 Unites Commission moving forward if they add more people to it, because like I said, they only have 3. So in this particular museum, it was about great people in New Jersey history, and you'll see Althea Gibson there. And another person who was in my museum was William Still, who was a great abolitionist that not many people know about, who actually helped on the Underground Railroad. And he was a Black man who lived in South Jersey. So that would be another way or another strategy to use for K-6 or beyond. The other piece is bring in speakers. So as I stated with VTS or visual thinking strategies, you have the Leroy Campbell painting there. I took the time to go through social media, and I found him on social media, and he actually came to my classroom to talk about living in South Carolina and to talk about the stories his family would tell him about picking cotton and being sharecroppers, and some of his family being enslaved. And the last thing I would do, or one of the other things I would do, is use warm and cool lessons of truth. So that's where using all the 1619 project and the 1716 Unites curriculum. You can't use the 1776 commission because it's not there. But so I would use those two if I was still in the classroom to teach warm and cool lessons. So yes, we do have a lot of people we can celebrate, but we also need to know from what they've come to get to that point, right? So when you're teaching about enslaved people and freed people, or if you're teaching about Frederick Douglass, you don't just talk about him having these conversations with Abraham Lincoln. You do talk about the fact that he was once enslaved. So these were a few of the strategies I would use with my students. And I know Dr. Davis said something about complementary lessons, and we teachers would say supplementary lessons. So we would use supplement and complementary lessons to go along with the themed months. And once we were able to get to history and culture and a social studies text, we would add it in there as well. But the great thing about all of this, living in New Jersey, we do have the Amistad legislation that says we don't wait until February to teach about Black history. You do that from the first day of school to the very last day of school. So those were just a few ways to do it. And if you're not aware of the New Jersey Amistad web legislation, the QR code is there. The one that says "Scan Me" would take you directly to the website to learn more.
And I do hope people are taking advantage of the opportunity to learn more, certainly having resources at your fingertips. At this moment, I would like to do two things. First, want to check and see who's still in the room. We did have a number of people to register from a variety of backgrounds and experiences, but those who registered may not have actually showed up. So if we could at this time, Joe, launch the poll and have people kind of check into what their affiliation is to MSU. And that will perhaps also give us an opportunity to perhaps better craft our responses to the audience. We have about 30 minutes remaining, and we're doing great on time. So thank you very much to the panel for being responsive and being thorough in your answers. Joe will reveal the results when it looks like most of the people have voted. I know that Antonella has some questions. So are they to the panel or to a particular panelist?
Yeah, so it's mostly to the panel.
Okay, great.
We did get a question, and it was in relation to our conversation about the relationship between the narrative and the power. And he wanted to know more about that and about the question about whose story is told.
Okay.
Anybody wants to talk about more about that?
And that's great. So it looks like most of our audience is from the community. So in your response, think about the ways in which people who may not be in classrooms or who are not educators might begin to better access and process this information. Thanks for the poll, Joe. Who would like to go first? Antonella, maybe one more time with the question. I know I was talking.
Yeah, no problem. So it was mostly about this participant wants to hear more about the relationship between the narrative and power, and like learning about more about the question of whose story is told.
Thank you.
I can begin the conversation around that.
Thank you.
Because there is a relationship of power of who gets to tell the story, right? And I think that an important first step is to acknowledge that it is a position of power of who gets to tell the story, right? And so what I would invite community members and teachers to think about is, in any instance, when I'm receiving information, who's giving me that information? When I'm listening to a news source, who's giving me that information, and what might another perspective be? Specifically for those who are educators in the room, and for community members who have young learners, because my area is elementary, I would encourage us to bring this to light for young learners, so that young learners are questioning who's telling the story and are questioning the ways in which they frame information as well. Because an integral part of social studies, at the heart of social studies, is decision making, right? And so if they are to become active participants, and if we are to become active participants in our communities, we have to be able to take information, make claims, have evidence to support that, and then make decisions. And that's the whole purpose of social studies, and recognizing that power dynamic in order to share that power, because historically that power has not been shared.
Thank you.
Can I
Anyone else?
add something
Yeah.
to that, Danae?
Sure.
One of the things that really stands out when you study these debates over time about what we should teach in US history is just how controversial these topics are. Even historians don't agree, right? So right now you have historians on the left who are disagreeing with the 1619 project and historians on the right. So there's like debates within among scholars. And then there's citizens in this country. And citizens have a tremendous amount of power to shape the history curriculum. And they have had this power historically. And there's a lot of people who know this. Many of these people work in and with conservative organizations and groups. So patriotic organizations and patriotic groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution or the John Birch Society historically has worked to mobilize grassroots campaigns of people, parents, teachers, ministers, family members, cousins, grandparents, to write letters to their local board of education or to their newspapers or to their state representatives, and they will complain about what's being taught in schools. Perhaps they disagree with some aspect of the curriculum. Perhaps they want something added. And here's what's amazing is that in the end, the people who make the choices about this tend to be the textbook publishers.
Interesting.
Because the textbook publishers in this country are private publishing groups. And these textbooks, these US history textbooks, have an enormous market. They make a ton of money for the textbook publishers, and they are willing to do just about anything to get their books sold, including they don't do this anymore, but back in the day, sure, they just printed an edition for the Southerners who demanded lines in the text saying that slavery wasn't so bad and that the war of Northern aggression was really a result of these pesky Northerners and their skewed morals, right? So even today, it is quite possible for people to mobilize in a grassroots campaign on the right, on the left, in the center, and persuade textbook publishers, local boards of education, and state representatives to do things like remove a book from the accepted textbook list or demand a change to a textbook if it's going to be taught in the schools. So one of the things that we've ended up with, like you might have noticed this too, especially if you have a high schooler or if you teach high school history, is our US history textbooks are like 700 pages sometimes. Like they're these really dense, really heavy books. And one reason that they're so dense and they're so heavy is because the publishers are like scrambling to try to please everybody. So one of the things that you'll see in these textbooks is like a lot of sidebars or like inclusive like cutout boxes, like with women's history or Polish American history or Black history or Native American history, right? So we've been kind of adding and adding and adding to this story, but it's also a story, especially in K through 12 education, especially in US history textbooks, that has been simplified, I think oversimplified, and it tends to emphasize what most American citizens want to hear, which is some kind of story of progress, story where we are moving toward justice, and that while Americans and this nation has had mistakes in the past, that we've been improving things over time. Most citizens, parents, family members, non-scholars, non-teachers want to hear some part of that positive story, one which some people describe as patriotic, right? They want our public schools to be patriotic. They want our schools to tell a story that makes students proud, and any story that might make people uncomfortable makes some of those parents nervous. So it's really interesting when you look at not only kind of whose voice is represented in the historical record and amongst the scholarship, but more specifically within the curriculum, it's really subject to political movements to change what's in those textbooks, which is why the textbooks and the curriculum, the official curriculum in many districts, is really very bland. And it's also why programs like the Amistad Commission here in New Jersey are so vitally important. And New Jersey, as you all may know, also has state laws requiring Holocaust and genocide education and requiring education about lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans contributions and history. That's a state decision. And that is a decision too, because that's in our state laws, that it empowers teachers to share those stories, even when parents, students, or even school administrators might not be super comfortable with some of those stories. So those state laws are really important.
So that brings to mind, I know all of us are in classrooms and work with students on different levels. What then do you do with when you meet the resistance, right? So if you have a curriculum, you know, your district says you need to teach something, if you are embraced with a particular discipline, you know, you have expertise and you know things. What do you do when you meet that resistance? I'm sure high school students will certainly push back. Kevin, do you receive any pushback from students? And if you do, how do you respond?
I mean, I definitely did not see pushback. Again, the 1619 project was really well received. Awesome. Because I think students appreciate hearing a story that's a lot more believable than the stories in their textbooks. I want to get back to a starting point. I think 1619, 1776 are just two relative points. I mean, you could start 1492 with colonization. You could start 1607 when the first settlers actually arrived in Jamestown. You have 1620 with the landing of the Mayflower. 1776, 1789 when the Constitution. So I think it's really a matter of whose narrative matters. And, you know, in Newark, when we received 1619, it's definitely a narrative that we understand. Just growing up in Newark myself, I never heard the story of me inside of any of these textbooks, me being a Puerto Rican descent. So similarly, when this Black and brown population is not receiving their story in school, it causes a disconnect as far as wanting to receive this information and feeling like you're a part of the American society as a whole. So I've always found it in my practice important to reach for the stories, reach for the controversies, because that's what sparks interest, and we cannot shy away from this racial question that we have. Students need to know that this race concept was a racial construct. They need to know about Bacon's Rebellion. They need to know about the functions of class in America. They need to know about the class interests of our founders so that they could form a more complete story of what America actually is. As far as resources, at the high school level, we're still primary source heavy. So as much as I can dig into primary sources, that's where I start my instruction. 1619, it is very high level. The readings were hard to grapple with. But again, once you use your scaffolding skills, once you chunk down text, once you create projects, project-based learning around certain concepts and let the kids go out there and start surveying and see what's going on, I think the totality of all these resources will get us to develop the critical thinker that's needed to get us past this race issue already.
Yeah, and we do need to have our young people to be really good and deep critical thinkers. Yes. Antonella, do you have a question or two for us?
Yes, so there's a question. It says, in your opinion, how has this history impacted our society today, specifically for underrepresented people, such as African Americans or Hispanics?
So who would like to answer that question? We heard a little bit of that from Kevin. No one?
I mean, it causes you to chase your own narrative. Sure. You know, once I found out, you know, Puerto Rico was a colony, you know, I was a little upset that I never even heard of this concept from my history teacher. And similarly, any population that doesn't hear their story, once they hear their story and they know and feel their truth, we still have to face it at that junction. So it's better to create a population of students that are ready to confront what our ancestors, predecessors set up for us.
Okay, thanks.
To also answer that question, you asked basically what it does for you if you're not represented, right? Or when you don't have that power. So most recently, I've been appointed to work with the Equity Council for Students in our district, and one of our high school students expressed how she felt about not being represented. She felt that she was behind the 8 ball, right? So then that brings us back to power, and I didn't have a chance to respond to that. But at the elementary level, you need to read the room. Read the room of your students, right? So if you're sitting in a room with students who are from all around the world, you need to make sure that they are all valued and they're heard and they find their own power. So you need to make resources available that are indicative to who they are and represent them. So I had one, not just one, but there's a Haitian student in my school where his teacher, she came to me and she asked, Miss Jackson, is there anything you have to help him know more about his people, right? And so I gave her some interesting information about Toussaint Louverture and other people from Haiti, and that gave him a sense of his own power, right? So you need to read the room. The other thing I wanted to say, when I think it was Dr. Burkholder, she was talking about the supplemental history text in the South and throughout the North and things. There's a book called Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools by Jonathan Zimmerman, because I know in the comments someone asked, well, where do you learn this information if you're not privy to it? So here's the text. I have a lot of notes in there because I read it several times. But Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools is a start to help you know what's missing, right? And how these textbooks were crafted in the past. So that's answering power, what happens when a student isn't represented, and going back to the construction of textbooks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Can I add something?
Absolutely.
I was just thinking, it's so important that we have these history curricula that are more inclusive, especially so that students who are not part of the, white majority maybe can feel included in the classroom and in this society more broadly. But then I think too, we have this problem where we have this pervasive white racism and white privilege in this society. And sometimes I think the people who need to be educated more about the contributions of African Americans and Indigenous Americans and Latinxes are white students, right? Like if we're gonna craft an anti-racist education and an anti-racist curriculum, we have to help our white students really learn that American history is this broader and much more diverse narrative. And that's what it is. And that these injustices and these struggles, these mass movements for justice are part of our history and part of the legacy. But so is racism and inequality in this society. So I think, it's just important that we keep in mind, even if you teach in Glen Ridge is right next door to Montclair, and it's an overwhelmingly white school district, right? And there's a good place where we need some really strong anti-racist lesson that focuses on histories other than perhaps the dominant one in most textbooks.
So what that reminds me of is, to Kimya's point, certainly reading the room, but you also have to look at what's not there, right? And helping people to realize the information and the perspectives that they need. Certainly we want to validate our students and allow them to see themselves in the curriculum. And Kevin has spoken to the value of that. But we also, as educators, want to make sure that we're doing right by our students to give them a full perspective.
Dr. Davis, I'd like to give an example there.
Yes.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Dr. Burkholder said, that this anti-racist education is not just to include Black and brown folks, but that white folks need to be hearing this as well. And a simple example from an elementary classroom that I still remember from when I was in grade 2, my teacher asked me to draw my family, and I drew my familia, like I had people on there, right? And my white educator told me, oh no, just your nuclear family, which I would like to invite you to really analyze the word nuclear. Like, why is that? Why is that? And I was like, nuclear, that sounds like it's about to go off. Like what's going on here? And she was like, oh, the ones that live with you. I was like, yeah, they all live with me. You know, we all live together, right? But what I want to bring up here is that she had a narrow definition of what a family is. And the study of families is part of elementary social studies. And my inclusion of my tías, my tíos, mis primos, right, was needed to validate my definition of family, but it was also needed for other students in the room to understand that family can have multiple definitions. It's this idea of multiple perspectives, of honoring multiple perspectives.
Thank you. Thanks for that firsthand perspective.
So Dr. Davis, I wanted to go back to resistance for a second and to address the anti-racist and anti-bias curriculum. So once again, I am an assistant principal in West Orange, and if you know the demographics of West Orange, it has changed tremendously over time, but it is still pretty much the same. So for those who know West Orange, it has a large Irish community, a large European descent Jewish community, as well as a large Black and Brown community. And some of the resistance you can see on the slide that I've received in the past was, when will you teach, or when will my child learn white history? Yeah, so when will my child learn white history was one of the ways to say that, you know, maybe this is too much Black history because you're teaching it beyond February. So I'm so happy that we do have the New Jersey Amistad legislation, because I presented it yet again. I always present it in back to school night, and I present it as needed. The next one was, I'm afraid I may say the wrong thing. Can I just do MLK and Harriet Tubman and all American heroes? So that's where that 1776 comes in. So you kind of stroke the teachers who are not ready just yet, and give them a little 1776, but then scaffold them into other people and other experiences along the way. And I don't think I can find 25 different positive Black people. That was an interesting one for me, right? Because it's interesting that some educators would defer to entertainers as the only Black people to celebrate when it comes to introducing or discussing Black people. So over time, I've introduced other educators, and not just in West Orange, but in many different places. But I've taken the time to introduce them to scientists, authors, artists, all types of people who come from all walks of life outside of entertainers, because a lot of times we find that educators, not just our white friends, but Black people too, defer to entertainers. So at a very young age, I would introduce them to not just entertainment, but also philanthropists and academia, or finding the fact that a lot of these entertainers are also philanthropists and have done the work, the social justice work. So I do have another QR code there where it says early learner resources. For those of you who are working with children at home or working with children in school, I do have a few links there, and as time goes on, this is a website that I just created the other day, so I'll add more to it.
Cool.
I'll add more resources as time goes on, so you can always go back to check in, especially those of you who are working with your children from home due to COVID. You can definitely start by using these resources.
Okay. We are coming close to our time. I want to make sure that we try to get maybe one or two more questions, Antonella.
So this question is from a 6th grade teacher who's teaching about slavery in America right now. And the question is, what is the appropriate term when referring to enslaved people? For example, those that were captured during the Middle Passage, I refer to them as Africans. Enslaved people born in America, do I refer to them as African American, Black, or should I be using a different term?
Nomenclature is important. Yeah. Who wants to help us with that one? Dr. Wilson, do you have any perspective?
Sure. I'll offer a viewpoint on that.
Thank you.
And there's another question that I can sort of tie into that as well.
Great.
From an anonymous attendee, said, can we discuss a move to include African history For example, the Moors, the Kingdom of Kush, Great Zimbabwe, and others. So I think that the easiest way to say that is we really have to have greater definition of people as they're crossing the Atlantic Ocean and where they're coming from in Africa. So if we started where the anonymous person asked the question, I think it makes it a little easier because then you can say that it's the Mende people, or you could say it's the Ashanti people or whoever, and then they're coming across the Atlantic. And then when they end up in America, then you can redefine them using a better term than Africans in America. You can actually say the Mende in America or the Fante in America. The reason why the terminology is so confused is because we didn't know this history for such a long time. And then when we decided on incorporating this history, we just decided to focus on a continent of Africa and make everybody Africans, as opposed to talking about their identities. While we don't do that in Europe, we focus on a nation and then we bring them to America as Italians or Polish or Irish or whatever, but we don't do that with Africans. So that becomes the problem. If we were able to do that, then we could define them in different ways. We could define some of these people as Anglo-Africans, meaning that they're British Africans, that they traveled to England first and then were brought to the New World, or they traveled to the English colonies and then they came to the New World. We could redefine the way that we see, let's say, Dutch Africans who populated the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area for a long time. And so the nomenclature becomes then sort of a hodgepodge. There's no right answer and there's no wrong answer because of how we've been trained to think about this. But yes, for the most part, the first century or so, these people are Africans. In the second period, they are no longer Africans because the number of Africans in America are decreasing and the number of African Americans are increasing. So by the 19th century, the number of people of African ancestry who were born in the United States outnumber the population of people who came from Africa. And eventually, there are no longer any Africans coming to America unless they've been kidnapped and they've been brought by pirateers. So the majority of the African American population in the United States, for example, is homegrown, or in essence, they were born in America. And this is different than almost everywhere else in the Americas and in the Caribbean.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay.
I'm going to jump to, we need to transition to our closing. What I will do is I'm going to go back to the first slide and allow you to see everyone's affiliation. So if you have additional questions or want to follow up with any of our panelists, their affiliations are here, their university affiliations are here. So certainly reach out and ask any questions. You might want to trigger and say that you were part of the panel or listen to the webinar, excuse me, and are following up in that vein. The last thing I'd like for the panel to do is to provide us with a bit of a brief wrap up. So Twitter limits characters and many forms specify a word content. The 6-word memoir and 6-word stories are pretty popular structure in literary spaces. And at Montclair State, we even use 6-word speeches to send off our teacher candidates. So in that spirit, if you would, to each of the panelists, leave our audience with 6 words. They might be inspirational, they might harken back to some of the comments that you've made, or be about anything that you feel would be useful for the audience to hear. Let's hear your 6-word speeches.
I guess I can start.
Thank you.
Every student's story will be valued.
Thanks.
I would say good history is honest but blemished.
Know your purpose. Si se puede. Do I get more words to translate that one in case they don't speak Spanish? No, I don't. I just had to check.
I have a reworking of a quote. excellence in the face of adversity, everybody.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
I got one.
Great.
Question the dominant narrative, then vote.
Yeah, that's great. So to the panel tonight, you made tonight possible. To my colleagues representing K through 12 public education, Mr. Kevin Arroyo, Newark's American high school history teacher, Kimya Jackson from the West Orange Public Schools. To my colleagues in higher education, Dr. Jessica Ferreras-Stone of Western Washington University, Dr. Zoe Burkholder, and Dr. Leslie Wilson. Gracias, merci beaucoup, and thank you. I want to thank the College of Education and Human Services, the Department of Teaching and Learning, Mr. Joseph Bavazzano, Antonella Ramirez. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And a final thanks to be safe and remember to vote, and then help someone else get to the polls. Have a great night and be safe. Thank you. Oh, yes, we do have a poll to wrap up. I forget the polls. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts.